Hello everyone, and welcome to the second in the series of Bite-Sized Training for All as part of the celebration of 50 years of the Protection of Wrecks Act. Today's webinar is Accessing MoD Wrecks. The first presenter will be Matt Skelhorn. He is the Wreck Manager at Salvage and Marine Operations in the Ministry of Defence. He'll be followed by archaeologist, NAS trustee and successful MoD diving project coordinator, Claire Hallibone. So now it is my pleasure to introduce the first speaker today, Matt Skelhorn from the MoD. Thank you, Matt.
Thanks, Peter. All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Matt Skelhorn. I work for the MoD Salvage and Marine Operations team. And today I'm discussing accessing MoD wrecks. So, first of all, just a quick overview of what we'll be discussing today. Firstly, a little bit of background to Salvage and Marine Operations, or SALMO, and the MoD Wreck Management Programme. Basically, we carry out quite a niche role. We're responsible for managing the environmental and safety concerns associated with the Ministry of Defence wreck inventory. Then I'll be following that by talking about the Protection Military Remains Act. That's the bit of legislation that's peculiar to the MoD that we look after. Then I'll be going on to talking about how you can get involved in work on MoD wrecks via the Nautical Archeology Society, or NAS, Identifying Environmental and Explosive Hazards on Wrecks course that I present along with my colleague, Dr. Polly Hill. Then I'll be taking questions on what I've just been discussing, and then handing over to Claire, who'll be talking about HMS Nautical, one of the wrecks we're interested in, along with some other subjects. So moving swiftly along, a little bit of background to the wreck management program. So as mentioned, Salvage and Marine Operations manages the environmental and safety concerns associated with MoD wrecks, and that's primarily associated with the oil and ammunition remaining on those wrecks. And the idea that as these vessels decay naturally over time or through other means, there is the increasing risk of some of these pollutants coming off of them. And what we do is try and get to those wrecks and deal with those concerns before those pollutants get out and cause environmental issues. They can cause some real environmental problems, and the costs involved in cleaning up the mess after an uncontrolled release has taken place, they're quite significant. And it's generally a lot cheaper to get to wrecks and deal with them before such things happen. So this slide here just provides an overview of the inventory for which we're responsible. It's a global inventory, about 5,500 wrecks as mentioned. We currently believe that number fluctuates as we do more research, but we deal with pretty much anything from 1870 onwards. Up in the top left-hand corner of the slide there, you see HMS Captain, pretty much our earliest wreck. But we go down through the First and Second World Wars, pretty much through to the present day. Down in the bottom right-hand corner, you've got one of our from the Falklands War, pretty much our sort of most recent inventory of recent losses. As you can imagine, most of the wrecks we're interested in come from the First and Second World War, and the real focus is on the Second World War wrecks because it tends to be those that are more likely to contain oil. You've got more oil-fired ships at the time. As you can imagine, most of the wrecks we deal with are purpose-built Royal Navy or Royal Fleet auxiliary vessels, as shown in the centre there, the battleship that we've conducted quite a lot of work on, and which I'll be discussing in a little bit more detail in a couple of slides' time. But we also deal with merchant vessels that were taken up in an auxiliary capacity by the Royal Navy in both the First and Second World Wars. So in the top right-hand corner there, you've got the armed merchant cruiser HMS Dunvegan Castle, which was lost in the Second World War. A particular focus of concern of the vessels of the Royal Fleet Auxiliary, particularly the tankers. They operate, a large number of tanks in both the First and Second World Wars and through today. And down at the bottom left-hand corner of the slide there, you can see RFA Bordale, which was sunk in Norwegian waters in 1940, and from which the Norwegian authorities removed the oil a few years ago. So you've probably seen slides similar to this before, but this is just an overview of wrecks in Northwest European waters. It's a cut of the UK Hydrographic Office wrecks database for those who are interested. The database can be downloaded from the UKHO website, and it's displayed here on the Geographic Information System. You can download free geographic information systems, so with a little bit of background work and fairly easy to use, you can come up with similar pictures of this. Now, fortunately, the Ministry of Defence aren't responsible for all the wrecks you see here. In amongst all the red dots, you can see some yellow dots, and those are the wrecks that we think are on our database and for which we've got responsibility. But nonetheless, this gives you an idea of the sheer number of wrecks, the density in European waters. There's a huge number of vessels out there. Okay, so what are the things we're concerned about on wrecks? Well, I guess our focus primarily has been on the oil on them. I mentioned HMS Royal Oak in a couple of slides back, and here is the wreck of HMS Royal Oak. She was sunk by German torpedoes up in Scapa Flow, the Royal Navy Fleet anchorage off the north coast of Scotland in 1939, with a huge loss of life. Is now on the seabed. This is a multi-beam echo sounder image taken quite a few years ago now. But Royal Oak sat on the seabed, very shallow, not very far offshore, for a good number of years after the end of the Second World War. And then in the mid-1990s, oil started coming off the wreck in significant quantities. Although generally she's extremely well preserved, she's a fantastic example of a First World War era dreadnought battleship or dreadnought style battleship. Nonetheless, there are some real ongoing modern concerns associated with her. So as I say, the wreck started leaking oil in the 1990s, and from the early 2000s, salvage marine operations were involved in efforts to deal with that problem, and that was done via a process called hot tapping, where we went down onto the wreck, and our divers and some contracted in support basically drilled holes into the tank, connected up hoses, and removed the pollutants. And the whole point was to prevent issues like this. Here you see some of that oil coming out before we had a chance to get to it. It's large quantities. And Scapa Flow, it's a beautiful, pristine area, lots of wildlife, fish, other animals, seabird colonies, and you really don't want this kind of stuff sort of washing up on shore or causing any problems to them. Next slide is a close-up of just how horrible and gunky some of this oil is. So, all our efforts over the last few years have been to deal with this particular wreck. We completed oil removal, or the majority of the oil removal operation, back in 2009, and we're currently in a sort of a monitoring phase. So we go back to the wreck periodically to keep an eye on it. And at some point in the future, we probably will have to make another attempt to get access to some of the oil contained in the deeper tanks on the wreck. So it's not a quick fix with some of these things. They do present some ongoing issues. Other things we deal with are ammunition on wrecks. Now this slide here doesn't show you any ammunition. It shows you some ship's guns. They're not too much of a problem in themselves, but you do encounter things like this on wrecks. And for those of you involved in diving, certainly if you go diving on any sort of First or Second World War wreck, almost anywhere in the world, there's going to be a fair chance that you're going to encounter something like this. Now, what we absolutely advise is if you come across something like this, do not touch it, don't poke it, and certainly don't take it back to the surface or anything like that. Leave it alone, and also be a little bit cautious. I mean, this is very obviously, a pretty large caliber shell, but there are types of ammunition, certainly when after they've been on the seabed for 100 or so years, they don't necessarily look like this. But if you see anything you think is even remotely could remotely be ammunition, just don't touch it, leave it alone. Why are we concerned about them? Well, firstly, we don't want any sort of divers interfering with them, but we're also concerned about the explosive risk posed by them. Now, this is an area of ongoing research. We don't know how much of an issue it really is, but it's certainly something we sort of bear in mind. And moving on to the next, it's not just the explosive risk. What I want to highlight here is some work that's actually been done by some of our European counterparts in the North Sea REX project. Now, that's something you can Google if you're interested in, but they've been looking at some of the risks posed by chemicals leaking out of conventional ammunition on wrecks on the seabed, possibly getting into the food chain and things like that. There are a number of scientific reports in things like New Scientist, you can see up on the top left-hand corner there. And the results of that work generated some headlines around the world. The wreck, there's a wreck particularly they were interested in, which was a vessel called the John Mahon. It's a relatively small ship, but nonetheless, that one study generated headlines that kind of went around the globe, really. So I won't go into that in any detail, but if you're interested, Google that ship's name, look up some of these reports and find out some of this information. So these things are developing over time. It's ongoing research. We try and stay abreast of it. It's all relevant information. Okay, so that's a little bit of an overview of why we manage wrecks. The next few slides will go into a sort of brief introduction about how we go about looking at them. So wrecks are basically managed under the wreck management program via a 3-stage process, and you can see that outlined on this slide here. Firstly, wrecks go through what we call stage 1, and that's background research. So we don't have the capacity to do that in-house. There's only myself, my colleague, Dr. Polly Hill. She's an environmental scientist. So we've got lots of wrecks. We can't deal with them all. So we've contracted out the historic desk space assessment phase, or the historic best desk space assessment reports, which form a key constituent at stage 1. The HDBAs are basically based on background archival research. So there are reports looking at what were the ships we're interested in, what happened to them at the time of loss, what were they carrying on them, are there any reports about the state of the wreck at the present day, that kind of thing. What is the evidence for them containing pollutants and ammunition and the like. In addition to that, we may at this stage, or at stage 2, potentially as I'll come on to in a second, commission what we call an environmental desk space assessment. Now, we outsource this to another government department. That department is CFAS, the Centre for Environment, Fisheries and Agriculture Science. And one of the things they do is take the historic desk space assessment, see how much oil we think might be on that wreck, and then they'll do some modelling, basically looking at where might that oil end up if it leaked out of the wreck. And this all helps us to make a decision as to whether or not at this stage we can go, okay, this wreck doesn't look like it's a problem. It's maybe something we can downgrade as a risk, or something that's going to require more research. And by more research, I mean getting out there and conducting an on-site survey. Some wrecks, you actually have to get out to site to see how much of a risk they pose. And the on-site survey forms stage 2 of our methodology. So that's going out and using a variety of techniques to assess on the ground what state the wreck is in and whether it's likely to actually pose an environmental risk. And then for those wrecks that look like they could be a real problem, we move to stage 3, which is the intervention, and that's to get the oil off of the wrecks. To date, the only interventions we've conducted have been to remove oil, but in theory, in future, there may come a time when we have to remove ammunition as well. So that's the overview. What I'll now do over the next few slides is go into a little bit more detail about what's involved in those 3 stages. So at stage 1, when we're conducting the archival research, we're looking at all sorts, basically primary sources of documentation that can inform us about what condition those ships could have been in. So here's just a couple of examples from some archives on the left-hand side here. You've got a loss report, or a survivor's report rather. A lot of ships, when they sank during both the First and Second World War, if a survivor made it to shore, or senior survivors made it to shore, they were interviewed, and those reports can provide some really useful information on things like where was a ship sunk, what was it carrying on, was it armed, that kind of thing. What did they think had happened? How many torpedoes hit them? How many bombs did they think it hit them? That kind of thing. Whether oil had come off the wreck at the time, that's quite often reported. We don't just look at UK records though, and over on the right-hand side here, you can see an example page from a German First World War U-boat log, and these can be absolutely crucial. An awful lot of wrecks, or a lot of ships were sunk by U-boats, and if you can get an idea of, for example, how many torpedoes were fired at a ship and how many torpedoes the U-boat commander thought, you get an idea of what condition the ship or the wreck it eventually became might be in at the present day. So these are really useful sources of information. Other key information, you can be looking at things like ship's plans, available from places like the National Maritime Museum, or increasingly from Lloyd's Register Foundation, which has a fantastic archive of largely merchant vessel plans that are downloadable from their website. And ship's plans can tell you lots of information. How many guns did the ship have on it? Where were the torpedoes? Where were the ammunition? Where were the magazines? And such like. So very crucial information at both the historic desk space assessment stage 1 phase, at stage 2 when we're surveying, and certainly when we're going out and conducting an intervention. Now, if you're going out and doing an intervention, you want to be making sure that you're going into an oil tank to remove oil, and you're avoiding areas with ammunition and the like. Information can be things like photos. Photos of ships sinking, a surprising number from both the First and Second World War, and they provide some really useful information about the last moments of the ship, which might yield some information about the wreck of the present day. But sometimes you photos like this, and more importantly, the ship that lies behind it. In some cases, if you're very lucky, there might be a museum ship out there that might serve as a proxy for a ship of another class, of the same class, ends up as a wreck on the seabed. So here you see HMS Caroline, the National Museum of the Royal Navy site out in Belfast, and a number of Caroline's ships are wrecks on our inventory. So Caroline provides a fantastic source of information on those wrecks. Other ships, things like HMS Belfast, moored on the Thames, also saw ships of the same class lost. Things like HMS Edinburgh would be a good example of that. And if you ever find yourself overseas, not just in the UK, there are other museum ships that can yield some fantastic information. If you want to see a Flower class corvette or a Tribal class destroyer, both absolutely typical Royal Navy ships of the Second World War and ships that saw an awful lot of losses and resolved wrecks, go over to Canada where they've got 2 of those vessels preserved as museum ships. Okay, so that's just a quick overview of some of the sources we use for the historic death space assessment. For stage 2, for the on-site survey, we deploy a variety of different techniques. So here you see some members of the Salmo team out on a wreck up in Scapa Flow. It's about 18 months ago, using one of our smaller ROVs to conduct an inspection of a wreck. In this case, nice calm conditions, not quite as grim as it looks in some of the photographs, beautiful clear water, and this was a very suitable platform, pretty shallow depths to do a really good survey, get a really good sort of visual idea of what was going on in that wreck. There's other techniques as well, things like side scan sonar. This is a much cheaper technique to employ and maybe it's a little bit more accessible to diving groups and archaeology. There you can see an example of a side scan sonar image on the left there. That's the aircraft carrier HMS Dasher from the Second World War, and you're looking down onto the flight deck of that wreck in that instance. That's a relatively cheap and straightforward technique to deploy, but sometimes we have to use much more expensive techniques. Now, we don't have presently the in-house capability to get access to these really large assets, so there are some wrecks that we have to contract here. Large work class ROV, an example of that on the right hand side there, that's a large ROV just being lowered over the side of a ship to have a look at this wreck here. Now this is the bow section on its side of the First World War tanker SS Durban, which is a wreck just off the northeast coast of Anglesey that we had a look at about 18 months ago. What you can see here is the multi-beam echo sounder model of that wreck that we captured during that survey. And here you can see the ROV from the previous scene. Here renders a computer graphic moving along that wreck and conducting some measurements to try and determine if there is oil contained within the hull of that vessel. Just to give you a better idea of what an overview of the wreck looks like. Here's the full multi-beam image, and you get an idea that that tanker is on its side and suffered sort of partial collapse, and that has a bearing on the likelihood of it containing oil. So these are, if you want to get a really, really detailed overview of a wreck, these are the kind of techniques you have to employ. I mentioned CFAS earlier on. When they come out with us and my colleague Polly, one of the things they often do is collect sediment samples around the wrecks. Here you can see some sediment samples being analysed or being prepared for analysis in the lab rather. And what they're doing here is taking those sediment samples and they're looking for hydrocarbons in the sediment. So basically what quite often happens is oil will come out of a wreck. Not all of it ends up on the surface. A lot of it will sink to the seabed. And sometimes from such cores, you can get an idea of historical leaks, literally layers of oil found within the sediment. So they can give you an idea of what may have happened in the past. And quite often we find that many wrecks leaked out a long time ago and no longer pose a risk. And sometimes these sort of tests can help to get a better understanding of what may have happened previously. So that's stage 2, and then there's stage 3, and it's really only for those wrecks that we think pose a real problem. Here you see one of our divers carrying out a hot tapping operation, basically connecting up a hose to one of the tanks on HMS Royal Oak to pump oil from. And here you see another of our divers or some contracted in support that we use to conduct the same operation, but this time on the tanker RFA Darkdale off the island of St Helena in the middle of the Atlantic. Now, it's pretty fair to say that we've been very lucky with the wrecks that we've conducted interventions on so far. They've been comparatively shallow, and because they've been shallow, we've been able to use either our own or contracted in divers working on a surface supply system. I think it's fair to say that many of the wrecks I think we're going to be dealing with over the next few years are at much greater depths and are going to be technically far more challenging. We're going to have to either use large ROVs to carry out these sort of operations, or potentially saturation divers. So there are some real interesting technical challenges I think we're going to have to deal with over a few years, which should prove quite interesting. So, okay, that's just an overview of what we do and how we do it. This next section is a little bit of a precursor for those sort of like who are interested in doing sort of more work potentially on not just military RECs, but RECs more generally. And it's just initially an overview of our Protection Military Remains Act, which is the particular piece of legislation that the MoD looks after and which tries to afford at least a degree of protection to some of its RECs. So there is a QR codes up there, which provide, I think the one on the top provides a link back to the actual act itself online. And then down at the bottom, there's another QR code, and that provides access to some of the guidance being issued by the MoD on what you should do if you come across an MoD REC in international waters. And I would recommend that you refer to these. They're very good sources of information. So, much as I don't like doing this, I'm probably going to have to read this because I think it's probably the best way of doing it. So, Protection Military Remains Act provides protection to the RECs of military aircraft and designated military vessels. Now, the RECs of all military aircraft, be they British or from other nations that lie in UK territorial waters, are automatically protected, irrespective of if there was loss of life on them or whether the wrecking occurred during peacetime or wartime. And the RECs of UK military aircraft are also protected under the Act elsewhere in the world. Slightly different with military vessels. Military vessels have to be individually designated to be afforded protection under the Act. And RECs can be designated under the Act even if they lie outside of UK waters. So there's two types of protection under the Act which you should be aware of. Firstly, protected places. Now, protected places under this aspect of the Act, RECs are designated by name and can be designated even if the location of the REC is unknown, and that's kind of crucial. Certainly, many military aircraft, we have very little idea of where they ended up. The records are very poor, but even really quite large RECs can disappear. We'll often have reasonable sinking positions, but that can be very different to where the REC has ended up on the seabed. Military aircraft RECs are automatically protected, even though the crash sites of many remain undiscovered. And shipwrecks are specifically designated, and designation only applies to vessels lost after the 4th of August 1914. So under the protected places aspect of the RECs, it's basically any REC from the first, or military REC from the start of the First World War onwards can be protected under this thing. Vessels sunk or stranded while in the service of another country's armed forces protected if the REC lies in UK waters, and that's the reason why a number of German U-boats are protected under RECs, under the Act rather. And foreign military aircraft are automatically protected if the REC lies in UK waters as well. So there is that sort of quite encompassing protection afforded by it. Now, the key bit of information for anybody interested in carrying out any diving on these RECs is that diving is permitted. However, it is an offence to penetrate the REC, interfere with it, or disturb it, or remove anything from the site unless licensed to do so by the MoD. So basically, by all means, go and look, but don't touch. And there's that sort of like saying about leave only bubbles. And if you've got any concerns or anything that you're not sure about, get in touch with the Ministry of Defence and they'll be able to provide guidance. Now, currently 93 RECs are protected as or designated as protected places, and more are added to the list by periodic tranches. So basically every few years, a number of other RECs tended to be added to the protected places list. Now, the other mode of protection under the Act is to designate RECs as controlled sites. And RECs are designated by location and can be of a vessel or aircraft that was lost within the last 200 years. So it goes back a little bit further than the protected places side of things. Now, the key bit of information is that PMRA 1986 makes it illegal to conduct any operations, and that includes diving within the controlled sites. So you cannot just go to these and dive on them. However, applications to conduct, for example, archaeological surveys can be made to the MoD and may be granted. There's no guarantee, but they may be granted if a strong enough case is made for the visit. So an example of where a license has been given would be on HMS Natal, which Claire will be discussing shortly. But it's also worth pointing out that these strictures also apply to ourselves in salvage and marine operations. HMS Royal Oak is a controlled site under PMRA 1986. And when I say, we go to periodic monitoring, maintenance of the valves that are installed on the wrecks and such like, we can't do that without first going and getting permission from our counterparts in the Navy Command 3rd Sector Heritage Team who administer this act. Now, 13 wrecks are currently designated as controlled sites. This last paragraph down the bottom is a little bit wordy, but it's basically saying, who you should contact if you've got an inquiry or if you're thinking about applying for a license to carry out any work on a controlled site. Firstly, as mentioned, the folks who look after this act for the MoD are the 3rd Sector Team down at Navy Command in Whale Island at Portsmouth, address there. And if for any reason you're interested in a military aircraft wreck, I'd get in touch with the Joint Casualty and Compassionate Centre based in Gloucester. The address also at the bottom of this slide, and they'll be able to assist asking any questions. And it's always good practice to talk to them beforehand if you've got any sort of thoughts about, visiting any of those wrecks or potentially conducting any work on them. Right. Finally, I'll be talking about how you can get a little bit more involved in activities on MoD wrecks. And a great way of doing that is by the Nautical Archeology Society identifying environmental and explosive hazards on wrecks courses. And you really have to excuse me, I'm going to have to read out the sales pitch for this, but I think it's pretty good and pretty better than me trying to paraphrase it. So the aim of the course is to raise awareness of the environmental and explosive risks associated with wrecks, with participants gaining an understanding of how to appropriately respond to those identified hazards. The course will outline desk-based and on-site assessments of wrecks with environmentally explosive threats, and will go through several case studies showing how the process works. The course is aimed at individuals undertaking the NAS training program, divers who have an interest in military wrecks, and professional archaeologists who might also be working on military wrecks. And the objectives of the course are to gain an understanding of the MoD wreck management program, building on this sort of cursory introduction you've had here, to understand the types of oil on wrecks and their effect on the environment, and that aspect is led by my colleague, Dr. Polly Hill, who is an environmental scientist and has got a great deal of previous experience in dealing with polluting wrecks. Thirdly, to gain a cursory understanding of different munition types found on wrecks. As mentioned before, we don't want anybody going around and poking at these things, but it's to gain a better understanding of what they are and the kinds of hazards that you could encounter. Also, to learn a little bit more about the desk space and on-site wreck integrity assessments that we undertake. To complete a desk space wreck integrity assessment, that's the HDBA I mentioned earlier on. I'll mention this a little bit more in a couple of slides. To learn about desk space and on-site environmental risk assessments, and finally to gain an understanding of some case studies and examples that we are currently working on. So we try and give you some information on some of the projects that we are currently engaged with. So as mentioned, under the course, or as part of the course, you will have the opportunity to complete an historic desk space assessment. And the wreck we use for that purpose is this vessel here. This is the tanker SS War Metar, which was lost off the east coast in the Second World War with quite a large cargo of ammunition, and it's a wreck we've carried out work on in the last few years. That's what she looked like when she was afloat. Looks like she's transiting the Suez Canal in that image, and this is a beam image of the wreck at the present day. So a largely intact Second World War era tanker, and certainly something of interest and potential concern.
Thanks very much for that, Matt. That was a great presentation. We are going to hear from Claire Halliburn, who is a NAS member, NAS trustee, archaeologist, and she is going to impart her practical knowledge of how she managed to run an entire dive project on an MoD wreck. So thank you very much, Claire.
Brilliant. Okay, so my name is Claire Halliburn, and last summer we undertook some field work on the HMS Natal, which is a controlled site in the Cromarty Firth in the north of Scotland. So I'm just going to talk you through how we obtained that license and what the process was for us obtaining that. So back in 2018, we actually started our talks with the MoD because NAS members were looking for opportunities to do some projects. And after sitting down with the MoD, we realised that the MoD needed some information on the condition of some of their wrecks. So we looked at their inventory, which was a bit astonishing to find out there were over 1,500 wrecked warships, submarines and auxiliaries, mainly dating from World War I and World War II around the UK. So from that, we were a bit, wow, where do we start? So we decided to look at just the controlled and protected sites, compile a list of them using some of the websites over on the right-hand side there, and gather the information on the location of these wrecks and the depths. Then what we did was filter them into a list of diveable and non-diveable sites, depending on where they were located and also what depths they were in. So in 2019, we presented the list to the MoD, and at the time we had identified 77 wrecks. And we were very disappointed after doing all this work to find out that only 14 of them were actually in a diveable depth with a maximum depth of 35 metres. So we sent this list over to Matt and Polly, and they assessed it and prepared a list of priorities that they would like to see work being done on. So when that list came back, we quite quickly decided that the HMS Natal in the Cromarty Firth in Scotland was the one that we were going to do and look at first. And I don't know whether you can see it here, but Inverness is here and the Cromarty Firth is here. So this is where the Natal was. So we couldn't have got a more remote site, to be honest, for logistics. So how did we go about planning? A bit of information about the Natal. The Natal is a Warrior class armoured cruiser. She was built by Vickers and Barrow and actually completed in 1907. She was the first Royal Navy ship of her name, and that is actually quite important because names were used quite consistently, and you do get some ships with some names that are used by several ships, and that actually really hinders the research that you can do on the vessel, because you're not quite sure exactly which wreck you're looking at sometimes when you go back through the archives. This particular Natal was coal-fired, but with an emergency oil supply. So once we'd narrowed it down exactly which ship we were going to start looking at first, the next stage was to prepare a project plan for the MoD so that they knew exactly what we were going to do and exactly what we were going to produce after we'd done all the field work to allow them to have some information. Then alongside that, we had to complete the licence applications and also work with Matt and Polly to create training courses to equip the project team with the skills and the knowledge to undertake the underwater surveys. So this is where the Identifying Environmental and Explosives Hazard on Wreck course originated, and it goes through a series of training sessions so that we understand what we're going to look at on the wreck, and we're able then to when we see things on the wreck, we're able to identify them into different either environmental or explosive hazards. So the planning for the Natal could then really take place. But unfortunately, COVID struck sort of early 2020, so we couldn't actually get to visit the Cromarty until November 2020. And when we turned up there, as you can see, there's lots of oil rigs sort of sitting in the Cromarty Firth. The cruise ships go in and out as well. And logistically, there's not any dive boats in that area. So we knew that we had to do some expedition type planning. So in arranging boats, compressors, accommodation. This put in lots and lots of other training opportunities, not only for NAS training, but also we could actually do some dive training. So there were lots of BZAC diving opportunities, training opportunities here as well, with logistics and planning of the trip. And also we had to schedule in both the NAS courses that were required, because there was a minimum requirement required for NAS qualifications, and also we had to do, every member of the project team had to do the MoD training courses as well. So when we were granted our licence, we have to take into account some of the conditions that we were given, and these the whole project team has to adhere to, and whoever's name is on the licence, as you can see, it was me up here, I have to make sure that everybody that visits the site under this licence adheres to all these conditions. And so typical conditions would be that you are not able to recover any artefacts from the site, you're not able to tamper or damage, move or remove any human remains. You're also not allowed to film or photograph any human remains or enter any hatch or opening in the wreck. And also you're not allowed to charge divers who are not the licensee to visit the controlled site either. Lots of conditions on photographs and film, and also that we must notify Navy Command when we are taking place, because while we were on the site of the Natal, we could hear all the radio traffic coming in and out, and everybody was actually radioing port control, checking that we had a licence to be on the site. So it is nice to know that people are looking out for these protected and controlled sites. So the licence that we were granted, we were actually granted 2 licences for the Natal. One was for a side-scan sonar survey in February 2022, and we worked with Sula Diving and Halton Charters to provide an NAS course in side-scan sonar survey, and this gave us the first lot of information about the site. As you can see, I don't know whether you can really make out from this slide, but we had loads of fun going up and down and getting as much information as we could on the Natal and also around the wreck as well. And it provided some information to suggest that actually this wreck was pretty broken up. It had been salvaged and it had been wire swept as well. So we knew that we weren't really going to get any intact wreckage. The second licence was granted for diver surveys, which took place in August and September 2022. And this allowed us to lay baselines and arrange our dive sites so that we could locate the environmental hazards on the wreck and map them. And I'm not going to show you the results at the moment. We're working through the report, so hopefully that will be available shortly. And this is just a picture of the first team that worked on the Natal. Unfortunately, we haven't got a full picture of the second team to show you, but it was a very successful 2 weeks of field work. And when the report is available, we will share that with you. Thank you.
I'd like to say a big thank you to Matt and Claire for your presentations today, and also a big thank you to Historic England for ensuring that these bite-sized webinars are free for everyone to attend and watch online whenever they like. This will be on YouTube very soon. If you're interested in finding out how to make sure protected wreck sites are kept safe from unauthorised human interference, please check out our next bite-sized training video on site security and heritage crime. Thank you very much.